So let me start with a quote from Erasmus. This Paul of ours is always skillful and slippery, but in these two epistles, he's talking about 1st and 2nd Corinthians, he's such a squid, such a chameleon. He plays the part of Proteus or Vertumnus to such a tune that in dealing with the Corinthians, who are more than Greeks, he seems somehow to exemplify the old proverb, Cretan with Cretan stand, turning himself into every shape that he may shape them anew for Christ. With such freedom does he himself twist and turn, like a man who threads the windings of a maze, and appearing to us in a fresh guise every time. So we'll return to that at the end of my talk. My book, which Corinne mentioned, is an analysis of Calvin's efforts to make France reformed. It argues that he and his colleagues employed various means of deception, not gratuitously, but because it was essential and because it helped the growth of the French Reformed Church. And it argues that because these acts were deliberate, they must have been planned. I want to look today at a part of that argument, specifically Calvin's crafting of his public image and the way he uses that to hide the efforts that he and his colleagues are engaged in to reform France. So we'll look at that idea of what I mean by Calvin using language to craft his public image. Then we'll look at two major undertakings he and his colleagues engage in to grow the French Reformed Church, and then I'll try to show you how he hides those major undertakings. So we'll start with 1533. The date is arbitrary. If you want to argue that he involves himself in illegal activities earlier or later, that's fine. But he does begin to involve himself in illegal activities and associates with heretics around the time of 1533. I will remind us what James K. Farge says, which is, at this point in time, heresy is not just a sin, it's also a crime. So Calvin is engaged in criminal activities. He is now, I think everybody agrees, or most people agree, he co-authored the address given by Nicolas Cop when he appointed rector of University of Paris. It provoked so much consternation on the part of the Sorbonne and almost got Calvin arrested. So he has to flee. As he flees, he meets evangelicals who have broken away from the Roman Catholic Church and begun to try to worship God according to Scripture. He teaches some of them. He enjoys the Lord's Supper with some outside of Poitiers. He befriends various criminal heretics, possibly Guillaume Farel in Basel in 1533, but certainly Martin Bucer, Oswald Myconius, etc., lots of them. And he would have been known to those sorts of communities. He helps his cousin Olivitan to publish an illegal French Bible translation, and he writes a Latin preface for it. The translation is illegal because it does not have what they call privilege to publish. And he declares in the preface, no human authorization is needed to publish this Bible. The King of Kings grants us privilege to publish. That was in June of 1535. In August, 2 months later, he writes the more famous preface, and I want to suggest to you that in that preface he declares himself innocent and loyal to Francis I. Now you'll remember this preface to Francis I is written after the affair of the placards, when numerous people are arrested, some of them are put to death, including one of Calvin's friends. And so there are scholars who argue that Calvin wrote the preface in order to try to convince Francis and the French court that evangelicalism was biblical and it was safe. There is a problem with that. There's a problem with that, in my judgment, there is. And that is, it doesn't try to explain why Calvin inserts himself so much into the preface. And so I want to argue with Olivier Millet, argue in agreement with Olivier Millet, Jean-François Gillemot, and Bernard Coutreau, among others, that he writes the preface in order to craft his public image. And let me go into a bit of explanation what is meant by that. If we just look at the contents of the preface itself, early in the preface, as if to explain that the preface is actually about himself, he inserts a disclaimer saying it's not. He says early in the preface, "Let it not be imagined that I am here framing my own private defense with the view of obtaining a safe return to my homeland." And continuing, in fact, throughout the preface, he aligns himself with the evangelicals. It's constantly we, our. And he insists that the evangelicals are loyal and innocent. And just to be crystal clear, he insists that he himself is as well, even though he had been involved in the criminal activities we really briefly outlined. The preface is elegant, unsurprisingly. It contains lines of thought that you'll recognize if you know Calvin's theology. He declares early in it that certain evil men are filling the ears of Francis. Am I saying Francis the First? I mean Francis the Second. Apologies. We'll get to Francis the Second later. Francis the First. He insists that evil men are filling Francis the First's ears with lies about evangelicals, and so he is going to correct those lies. We are wrongly charged with intentions of a sort we've never even given the slightest suspicion of. We, if you listen to our adversaries, are seeking the overthrow of kingdoms, sort of implying nothing could be further from the truth. We, from whom not one seditious word was ever heard, and whose life, while passed under your reign, is known to have always been quiet and simple, and we now also, though exiled from our homeland, do not cease to pray for all prosperity for yourself and for your kingdom. So these are, as I say, elegant words, but if you assess the accuracy, the truthfulness of them, it seems to me that they simply run contrary to the facts. There's no doubt that the Sorbonne may have exaggerated assertions about Calvin and the evangelicals, but Calvin was not innocent and was not obedient. And so it's difficult to steer clear of the idea that Calvin's engaging in some forms of equivocation. And so I would agree with the claim that he is writing this to try to craft a particular image of himself. And I would furthermore assert that he has two audiences in mind. He has in mind Francis I and Francis's court, and he wants to essentially persuade them, at the very least, that he's not a problem. And he has in mind the French evangelicals. It's as if Calvin is allowing them to eavesdrop on his defending them against the French king. And I think he's doing this towards the end of continuing the work that he had started with French evangelicals, whom he had met for the last 2 years. Now this is early, this is 1535, and it sets Calvin up very nicely for almost 30 years worth of work with the French evangelicals, and so that's where he heads, and that's where we're headed. So that's where we have covered, and what we'll cover now, two major undertakings or campaigns to try to make France more reformed and grow the French Reformed Church. The first then is this work with the French ministry, and I will say, of course, this is after Calvin gets himself established in Geneva, so we're sort of thinking, if you know your Calvin chronology, sort of 1536, 37, he's kicked out in 38, and he comes back in 41. In the most basic sense, Calvin wants to grow the French Reformed Church, which means being able to send them things and being able to communicate with them. And to some degree, it also means being able to control their behavior. And we'll see what I mean by that in a moment. I've sort of boiled this down to his aspiration with the French Reformed. He wants to make them invisible as communities. He wants them to be able to communicate with them invisibly, and he wants to establish invisible movement of people, or really invisible movement of pastors. So we'll cover each one of those in turn, starting with invisible communities. What do we mean by that? So Calvin and his colleagues attempt to cloak the presence of French Reformed communities. Now we might think that that means he writes to them or sends emissaries and tells them, bear witness to Christ to your neighbor, but just be careful about it. That's not what it means. He tells French evangelical churches to meet in private homes. He tells them that everyone should make their homes available for that purpose, and he tells them they shouldn't meet in the same homes all the time. They should move from house to house. With church communities who are telling Calvin and Beza that they want to preach the gospel publicly, he writes them and tells them, don't do that. It's not the right time. And lest we think this is just some passing comment he made to one congregation, he writes to Heinrich Bullinger in 1560 September, complaining about the fact that French evangelical communities aren't obeying him on this point. He also, as you may well know, complains about them over things like iconoclasm, church occupation, vandalism. And here I'm in full agreement with Robert Kingdon. I don't think Calvin had some deep-seated opposition to iconoclasm. I think he thought it was strategically stupid. It's drawing the wrong kind of attention to communities that he wants to be invisible, to hide. He also, and I'll say more about this when we get to the sending of pastors across the border, but he also tells every one of the pastors he sends across the border, I want you to operate, once you get to your charge, in secrecy. Now the interesting thing here, and the thing I think it actually goes towards my argument that all of this is according to an agenda, according to a plan, is Calvin lambasts the Nicodemuites for doing exactly what he's telling the French Reformed to do, which is hide. I won't read quotes for the sake of time, but he accuses the Nicodemuites of trying to craft a form of Christianity that would allow them to avoid suffering persecution. Then he turns right around and tells Reformed communities how they may avoid suffering persecution. And I think it's suggestive of the fact that he's desperate to have them hide. He knows in many of these communities, if the authorities found out of their existence, that would be the end of that community. So we can now go on to invisible communications. Here we're thinking of communication by means of emissary or messenger. I mean, in some cases, almost temporary missionary. Communications through books and communications through letters. Here there's a division of labor. The emissaries or messengers that tend to be used, Theodore Beza, Francois Hotman, Franz Morel, Calvin's brother Antoine. Calvin himself tends to be the guy who writes letters and writes books. All of this, you might be thinking to yourself, might cost some money, and so much of it ends up being funded by the Bourse Français, which is a fund that's established around 1550, maybe a little bit earlier. It's ostensibly established to fund the growing number of refugees in the city of Geneva. And if you haven't read Janine Olson's fantastic work on it, I would highly recommend doing that. But Calvin tends, and Janine acknowledges this, to make ready use of the Bourse Français funds when it helps his missionary endeavors. In fact, the very first entry in the records of the Bourse Français is a payment to Denis Regnier, who copied down Calvin's sermons so that they could then be sent off. To ensure the safety of these messengers and the colporteurs who carried the books across the border, they employed basically two means. One was forged documents, false occupations. Robert Kingdon talks about the discovery of what was effectively a fake passport that would have been used. And then, of course, they also hired travel guides who could ensure the safest routes, who could move from safe house to safe house. I won't say a huge amount about book trade because of the sake of time, but Laurent de Normandie, who was also, like Calvin, born in Noyon, is the man that they make use of. He's an important figure in French publishing, and he manages to ensure that his colporteurs get these books to Reformed congregations. Then in terms of letters, Calvin writes not infrequently of looking for a trustworthy messenger or waiting for one. This is why my letter's delayed. Of course, they on occasion, and we'll look at an occasion later on, will use code words in the letters itself. And of course, Calvin uses pseudonyms. The first discovery of a letter signed by Calvin with a pseudonym is almost startlingly early, 1532, even before he flees. And he's still sending letters into France signed with a pseudonym in 1564. And another thing that is suggestive of my thinking that there's a plan here, an agenda here, is the decision of using a pseudonym on a letter is not determined by the content of the letter or by the recipient. So you can find letters that are boring. The Sorbonne would not, would yawn if they read the letter. It's still signed with a pseudonym. You can find letters sent to the French nobility or to Calvin's friend Francois Daniel, signed with a pseudonym. And I think the point is he's concerned about the safety of the recipient. If you have a letter on your kitchen table signed from John Calvin, that's not a good thing, and he knows it. So he's concerned. So now we can go on to invisible movement of people, or really invisible movement of pastors. Here we're thinking of the work that they did starting either in late 1555 or early 1556 of sending trained pastors across the border to minister in French Reformed churches. It is started right after the riot in May, which gave Calvin the kind of freedom to do things that he didn't have previously. And I will say, again, in terms of planning, it suggests to me the speed with which they were able to turn this around, that it's something Calvin already had it planned in his head, and he was waiting for the right opportunity to start doing it. Calvin does say that ministers are essential. He writes in an undated letter to Heinrich Bullinger, certainly nothing delays the course of the kingdom of Christ in France more than the lack of ministers. Secrecy here would have been essential, not only the secrecy of sending a pastor across the border, but also political secrecy. I mean, they were doing the 16th century equivalent of sending a terrorist into France. It was a desperately dangerous occupation, and so it's probably not surprising that Calvin and the company of pastors kept hidden from the Genevan Little Council for the first year the fact that they were doing this. It's not until late 1557 that Calvin tells the Little Council that they're sending trained ministers across the border into France. This also would have been at least partly funded by the Bourse Français, in particular funding the families who often stayed behind in Geneva, making sure that they had what they needed. And again, I'll mention now what I already mentioned earlier, which is when a minister went across the border, he was told to operate once he reaches his charge in secrecy. So that's a bit about their French ministry and the attempt to do it secretly. And we can now go on to talk about political plotting. I need to give you a little bit of background. When King Henry II dies, July 1559, in this weird jousting accident that supposedly Nostradamus prophesied about, he's replaced by young 15-year-old King Francis II. This leads to increased persecution for Reformed congregations because the staunchly Catholic House of Guise are able to infiltrate the French throne, and they're able to do that because they're the uncles of Mary Queen of Scots, who's married to Francis II. So this is a time that Theodore Beza writes about in his history, quoting Matthew 24, had not those days been shortened, no flesh would have survived. I mean, that's the kind of feel for the Reformed communities during Francis II's reign. It's also the time when Anne du Bourg, the parliamentarian, is burned at the stake. Not only, though, does it increase persecution, it also increases the development of plots to try to deal with what they viewed as a very desperate situation. We'll look at two. The Amboise conspiracy is the first one, and it's easily the best well-known. La Renaudie is the mastermind behind it, and the plan was to essentially kidnap Francis II, 15-year-old kid, and keep him away from the influences of the House of Guise. La Renaudie visits Geneva to try to persuade Calvin Beza and the company of pastors. Beza gives La Renaudie a copy of the metrical translation of Psalm 94 that Beza himself had produced. Remember that's, O Lord, God of vengeance, shine forth. Calvin is less interested. For him, the big concern is the inclusion in any political plotting of Antoine, King of Navarre. Antoine is what they call first Prince of the Blood. For folk who've read Institute's Book 4, Chapter 20, Section 31, that is where Calvin talks about popular magistrates. And Antoine was effectively a popular magistrate. So Calvin's hope seems to have been that Antoine would take it upon himself to secretly, peacefully, sort of insert himself in as the guardian of Francis II. With the coronation of Francis II in September 21, 1559, that door is closed. So now begins an exchange of letters between Calvin, Theodore Beza, Francois Morel, Francois Hotman, and John Sturm. And their discussion is about using other means, which is Morel's phrase, to try to deal with the situation. And here, let me just bang out 4 points to sort of wrap up the Amboise conspiracy. First of all, before I forget to mention, it's a failure. People in the actual group leak the plans to the House of Guise. So but 4 points. One, letters exist between Calvin, Beza, Sturm, Hotman, and Morel, which seem to pretty clearly suggest that all of them agree to the implementation of other means to address this problem of Francis II being 15 and the House of Guise essentially controlling France. Even means that employ arms. That's point number one. Point number two, letters exist written after the failed Amboise conspiracy from Calvin, condemning it in extraordinarily strong language. So strong that if we weren't careful, we could assume that he's opposed to any and all political intervention. Point three, letters exist written by others after the failed Amboise conspiracy, saying they think Calvin and Beza are behind it. There's a letter from Johannes Haller, the Bernese pastor, to Heinrich Bullinger, Calvin's best mate, in May 5th, 1560, saying, if an investigation were to happen of the Amboise conspiracy, we would find that the Genevans are behind it. That might explain, point four, why Calvin is so adamantly writing these letters to make it crystal clear that he opposed the Amboise conspiracy. So, that's it. But Calvin was not opposed to any and all use of political means to solve this problem because he was involved in such a plot, and this allows us to go on to the Maligny affair, far less well-known than the Amboise conspiracy, partially maybe because Theodore Beza doesn't mention the Maligny affair in his history. He does mention the Amboise conspiracy. The groundbreaking work, I think, without doubt, is the 1963 piece by Ellen Dufour. There's a 2021 or 22 book by Philip Benedict that's superb on this. So led by Jean de Maligny, the plan was to take over Lyon and then to provide Antoine of Navarre, who again not only is first Prince of the Blood, but he's also believed that this time to have had Reformed sympathies. But he was at that time. With money, men, and arms, if he will use them to march on the French court, call an Estates General, get rid of the House of Guise, and appoint himself either as regent or very, very close to the young 15-year-old Francis II. This is all based on a legal argument. There's a letter from Francois Morel to Calvin, August 15th, 1559, in which he explains legally it's not right, proper for a king that young, 15, to reign without a regent. We don't have a regent. So there are legal grounds for Antoine to do what he did, but also for Calvin and Beza to be involved in the way that they were. So they do involve themselves. Remember, they had known Antoine. They didn't really trust him, but they'd known him since at least 1557. Calvin collects money. Beza goes to Nerac to be with Antoine of Navarre. Just if you want to take a look at a map sometime where Nerac is, it's way on the west coast. There was a price on Beza's head, basically. He was a dead man. So it must have been the most dangerous journey. And the Genevan Academy had just opened about a month earlier. And Calvin sends him. But anyway, so there are letters between Calvin and Beza that make it clear that plans weren't set up very well. There's a delay in the whole thing. Meanwhile, de Maligny has become impatient and gone to Lyon too early. The authorities find a stash of weapons in this guy named Constantine's house, and they realize something's going on, and it all goes belly up from there. And of course, by December 5th, everything changes, and we'll get to that. But that is their involvement in both French ministry and political plotting. We can now look at the cover-up. So if we wanted to do a thorough job, we would look at a shed load of letters, which I try to do to some degree in my book. For the sake of time, we can look at these four, and really we'll look primarily at this one to Charles IX in more detail. But we'll look at the letters to Bullinger first. No, can I just say, my point is, this claim of Calvin crafting his public image is based on lots of letters. It's not just two or three or four. Calvin engages, I just think Olivier Millet is golden on this, but he engages extraordinarily carefully in trying to craft his public image. But we'll look at these four. The first two, October 1st and October 14th, are unusual. Calvin mentions the Maligny affair, the discovery of arms in Lyon, to Bullinger. But of course he doesn't say, Beza and I were involved. He mentions it as a piece of news that he wonders if Bullinger had heard about. He then says he condemns the attempt on the part of the plotters because he's opposed to any use of arms to support our cause. He then, though, feels the need to explain to Bullinger why Beza was there. Now, if you read the letter, it looks like there means Lyon, but I think he must mean Nerac, because Beza never got to Lyon. So, but he says, make no mistake, Beza was not there of his own accord. I received a letter from Antoine of Navarre begging me to send Beza to him, and I didn't feel like I could deny the King of Navarre's request. The letter in October is slightly even weirder because it's a bit cryptic, but he raises again the discovery of arms in Lyon, and then goes on to seem to suggest that he tried to tell the plotters not to engage in this plot in the first place. The letter to Admiral Coligny is written, you can see, more than a year after the failed attempt conspiracy of Amboise. It's written to the admiral on the recommendation of Calvin's brother Antoine. And it's a very formal and very detailed condemnation of the Amboise conspiracy, of La Renaudie, of the shame that it brought on Geneva, etc., etc., etc. But I should say, none of these are signed with a pseudonym. Obviously, he wants people to know Calvin is opposed to these things. But in lots of ways, these pale in comparison to the letter to Charles IX. But to tell you about that, I need to give you a little bit of background. I told you everything changes December, and it does. young, sickly 15-year-old Francis II dies. Calvin is overjoyed. He writes to John Sturm, "Have you ever heard better news than the death of the king?" And he's overjoyed because he thinks he knows what's going to happen next. And lots of people feel the same way. Francis II's younger brother, who's 10, is going to be appointed king. Everybody knows a 10-year-old needs a regent. Well, who's the most likely person to be regent? Antoine of Navarre. So Calvin writes a letter to Antoine saying, here are 3 things that you should do when you take up this position, essentially. But of course, he never takes it up. Catherine de' Medici is either appointed regent or makes herself regent. And January 23rd, 1561, young king, 10-year-old Charles IX, sends an emissary to Geneva with a letter. That letter is asking about 2 things. Guess what 2 things it's asking about? It says, we've heard that you're sending preachers into France. We want you to withdraw every preacher that you sent in and send no more. Secondly, we've heard that you are involved in seditious plots. We want you to stop that. We demand a reply. Calvin writes the reply on behalf of the Genevan City Council, and that last bit is important. So Calvin begins by saying, again, writing as a city council, Geneva has always had good relations with your predecessors, and we wish you tranquility and prosperity of your kingdom. He then takes up the 2 charges. I want to go ahead and deal with the second one and get it out of the way. Unsurprisingly, he says Geneva protests against having ever entertained any such intention to stir up dissension and sedition. We've never given advice to make any innovation or attempted anything criminal with respect to your state, and we have laws in place that severely punish any Genevan who even takes one step in that direction. So that's the second one done. What's sort of more interesting is the first one. He writes first that the Genevan City Council protests in truth before God that Geneva had ever attempted to send any persons into your kingdom. Geneva sent one person out to preach, and that was to London. That was Nicholas d'Aguilar. But he then says, remember this is Calvin writing, concerning the first charge, he explains in the letter that the city council realizes the French king might have been accusing the city pastors of sending ministers into France, and so the city council summoned some of the pastors and asked them about this charge. Calvin indicates that the pastors explained certain men came to them. When the pastors realized that these men were educated and pious, they told these men that, quote, they should exercise their gifts wherever they should go for the advancement of the gospel. So that is Calvin's response to the first charge. And that is, again, an example, it seems to me, of Calvin crafting his image. In this case, with extraordinarily good outcomes. This is, of course, January 1561. He couldn't have known this at the time, but Catherine decides to break ranks with her predecessors and allow the Reformed faith to exist in France. And so you can see this is from work done by Jonathan Reed. The numbers in 1561 in terms of church planted, ministers sent 151. They couldn't have dreamed in their wildest dreams of being able to do that kind of thing. So then we go back to the notion of Calvin crafting his public image to do good, and that brings us back to the quote from Erasmus. I won't read it again. I'll just say a couple things and then close. I don't think the quote necessarily explains Calvin. The thing I like about the quote is it, in the simplest way, talks about a godly man, Paul, engaging in a godly pursuit, bringing the Corinthians to Christ. But Erasmus' treatment of it focuses primarily on Paul's method, which seems wholly disconnected to an interest in truth. And I find that idea just so full of interesting thoughts, thoughts that I'm hoping, can transfer from Erasmus' assessment of Paul to our assessment of Calvin. And so I will close.